Okay, so good evening to everyone. It's Jakub Hurta here from the webinar team from the Czech Republic, and I'm really happy that I could be online today with you. And I'm really happy that I can welcome our guest speaker for tonight, Leonardo De Chirico, who will be our guest speaker for tonight. And we are looking forward to your talk, Leonardo. Thank you so much for being with us tonight. And I would like to introduce our speaker. And Leonardo De Chirico is the pastor of Breccia di Roma, a church that he helped plant in Rome in 2019, and he's also vice chairman of the Italian Evangelical Alliance. And previously, he was working as a pastor, and he helped to start a church, and he pastored a church in Ferrara. And then he got many degrees, and he got his PhD at King's College in London. And he engages a lot with the work with the relation between the evangelical churches and Catholic Church, and he's also the leader of the Rome Scholars Network. So, Leonardo, thank you so much for being with us for tonight.
Well, thank you very much, Jakub, and thank you very much, friends, wherever you are around the world, for attending this webinar. And I'm delighted that we have the opportunity to reflect together on the topic which I entitled the Annus Horribilis of the Roman Catholic Church. What do evangelicals can say about it? And of course, Annus Horribilis is a Latin expression meaning terrible year. And I will be trying to cover three main points or headlines. One, surveying the recent events that made the last year or the last years terrible as far as the life of the Catholic Church, the global scale. Secondly, I will be reviewing two internal critical voices coming from inside of the Catholic Church, dealing with the same issue on what caused the terrible year and what can be done in order to overcome it. And thirdly and lastly, I will be touching on a very recent document that was released by the Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI on the issue of what caused the sexual abuse scandals outside and within the Catholic Church. And we will then conclude with some final remarks. So first of all, the description of what is, how can we characterize the terrible year that the Roman Catholic Church is going through. In the public opinion, the Catholic Church has always been associated with its stability, its traditional patterns, and its consistency. For many, this has been the image of the Catholic Church throughout the ages, even to the point of describing the present-day reality of the Catholic Church. But the present-day situation appears to be quite different. It appears to be uncertain, scrutinized, and wavering. The public image of the Catholic Church now is that of a disrupted institution going through a season of internal turmoil. And here are a few signs of the crisis. In September 2016, 4 cardinals sent to the Pope 5 questions. In Latin, questions are termed as dubia, doubts. These questions gave voice to the grave disorientation and great confusion that exists in the Catholic community concerning the interpretation of key parts of a recent papal pronouncement following the Synod of Bishops on the family. And the papal pronouncement, the papal text is the so-called Amoris Laetitia, the joy of love. The papal document that relaxes access to the sacraments by the divorced. That was the first sign of the Annus Horribilis. 5 cardinals asking a public official question to the Pope. How can we interpret your own writing on the access to the sacraments by the divorced people? Secondly, in July 2017, more than 200 Catholic priests and intellectuals from around the world wrote a filial correction concerning the propagation of heresies. That's the title of the document, signed by 200 priests and intellectuals. And they sent it to the Pope, and therefore elevating the tone of the criticism to the denunciation of doctrinal deviations. At the end of July the 2017, yet another instance of that terrible year. Father Thomas Waynandi, a former chief of staff for the US Bishops' Committee on Doctrine and a current member of the Vatican's International Theological Commission, made public a letter sent to the Pope. In this letter, he argued that a chronic, I quote, a chronic confusion seems to mark your pontificate, obscured by the ambiguity of your own words and actions. Notice, this is a top theologian writing to the Pope and making this statement public. And he talks about chronic confusion, ambiguity in words and actions by the Pope. According to Waynandi, this, I quote, fosters within the faithful a growing unease. It compromises their capacity for love, joy, and peace. You see, there is an increase in the tone of the criticism coming from inside. Cardinals asking formal questions about what is the teaching of the Pope, 200 intellectuals writing a correction to the Pope, a top theologian writing a strong word of criticism against the Pope. But this is only the tip of the iceberg, because over the last 10 years, horrible things have come out. First in Ireland, then Australia, then Chile, and more recently in the US, where a Pennsylvania grand jury report exposed abuses committed by priests. And then finally in Germany as well, with a recent report saying that 3,676 children have been abused by Catholic priests since the 1940s. These are just 5 regions where exposure of the traumatic evidence meant that the scandals could no longer be covered up. The impression is that we have not yet reached the peak. The vast echo of these scandals reached the Vatican headquarters when former Nuncio Carlo Maria Vigano accused vast sectors of the Roman Curia of covering them up and called for Francis's resignation due to his inability to properly deal with the abuses. Notice that these words were not written by an outsider of the Catholic Church, but by a high-rank official of the same institution. Cases of abuse are also emerging from Argentina and Nicaragua and many other places around the world. and they are involving also people very close to the Pope. So you see that the Annus Horribilis is not only coming from difficulties in interpretation of doctrine, but also out of the growing dimensions of the scandal of the abuses. What is happening in this terrible year undermines the moral, spiritual, and institutional credibility of Rome. Even though Pope Francis continues to cling to the idea that while the children of the Church make mistakes, that is, all people, Pope included, make mistakes, the Church in itself is indefectible. That is, it does not err, it doesn't make mistake. The reality is that it is a failure of the whole system. Its doctrines, practices, policies, and so on. The abuse scandal is not the case of few isolated black sheep, nor can the internal turmoil be interpreted as a physiological discussion in a large community. You know, the Catholic Church is big, and it is normal that a discussion runs through it. The tone, the depth of the criticism coming from within and from outside is making the situation worse and worse. Francis's recent letter to the Catholic people, signed on the 20th of August 2018, called for repentance and envisaged stricter procedures for the recruitment of the clergy, the prevention of the abuse, and the prosecution of abusers, which were then discussed at a meeting that was run in February, the 21st to the 24th of February this year. There was a 4-day conference of Catholic theologians and bishops discussing the issue of the sex abuse scandals and coming out with poor outcomes on what to do in order to prevent them in the future. The Pope Francis is also suggesting that the main problem that the Catholic Church is going through is what he calls clericalism. That is, an attitude marked by self-referentiality and detachment from the people. In a clericalist culture, the clergy often stand above and aloof from their flocks, thus creating the conditions for unchecked power to become abusive. In Francis's words, this is a perversion of the Church, and he often blames clericalism, as if clericalism, the abuse of power, is the main root of the problem causing this season of terrible cases. As true as this might be, is clericalism, the abuse of clerical power, the only thing to blame in trying to come to terms with what is happening? There is no doubt that Rome is going through difficult times. The institution that appeared strong and stable is now showing signs of serious weakness at various levels. The suggested diagnosis of the current crisis, first, the black sheep metaphor. That has been the traditional way of the Catholic Church, official Catholic Church, to deal with the abuse scandals. These, they said, are only black sheep, but the church is healthy. This metaphor is no longer attainable. The seriousness of the scandals and the pervasiveness of them need to be taken into account with a more radical reading of the situation. And even the reference to clericalism, the abuse of clerical power, is not sufficient to explain the latitude, the dramatic latitude of the problem. Both the black sheep explanation and the evil of clericalism seem to be self-protective attempts to explain what has happened, but also they seem to be ways that show the unwillingness of the Catholic Church to engage the real issues at stake. Both the diagnosis and the cure do not show, as far as I understand it, as far as I can see, any indication that radical biblical renewal is taking place in the Roman Catholic Church as a whole. The gospel is still obscured by centuries of unwillingness to expose the church to a time of doctrinal reformation and by scores of devotional practices that lead the faithful astray. Of course, there are movements and individuals here and there who are exploring within the Catholic Church what biblical faith really means. However, the institution at its highest level is not engaged in undergoing a serious biblical reformation. And this terrible year seems to be a lost opportunity to rediscover the truth, the purity, and the healing power of the biblical gospel. But this is only the first part of what is happening. An internal and external rise of the tone of criticism based on scandals, crimes, and evil behaviors, no longer being reducible to individual cases, but showing that we are dealing with a systemic problem within the Catholic Church, involving the recruitment procedures of seminarians, involving the life in Catholic seminaries, the teaching that is given there, the abuse of power that begins in the seminaries and goes on when priests are ordained and sent off to parishes to various tasks, and the incapability and at times the unwillingness of the institutional church to seriously deal with the problem after decades of attempts to cover up the problems instead of exposing them and trying to find a viable solution. But in recent months, the turmoil in the Roman Catholic Church has reached a further disruption point. At the beginning of February, so 2 months ago, 2 independent but influential texts circulated widely that expressed strong criticism against Pope Francis. In Europe, the German Cardinal Gerhard Müller issued a Manifesto of Faith, that's the title that he gave to his own document, in which he raised serious concerns over the downplaying of Roman Catholic identity under the present-day pontificate and suggested corrections to it. Now, he was the former prefect of the Sacred Congregation for Doctrine, that is, the main Vatican institution whose task is to uphold, support, and defend and promote Catholic doctrine. Now, the former head of this Vatican institution is publicly criticizing the Pope, something that is totally unconventional, unexpected, and unusual. In the US, the acclaimed journal First Things posted an article, always at the beginning of February, by an author called R.R. Reno, whose devastating thesis is evident from the title. The title is A Failing Papacy. That's the title of a conservative, Catholic, important magazine. Both attacks come from high-profile Roman Catholic sources and show that the terrible here of Rome is getting even worse. On both sides of the Atlantic, Pope Francis is under fire. Müller is the former prefect, as I said, of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, the highest Vatican authority in the area of doctrine after the Pope. He was named prefect by Pope Benedict XVI in 2012 and has become known for his conservative views with regards to the interpretation of Catholic doctrine and morals. In doing so, he collided with the open-ended and inclusive approach of Pope Francis, especially as to whether or not to readmit people in irregular relationships to the Eucharist, a topic that was discussed at the Synod of the Bishops and resulting in the papal document Amoris Laetitia, opening up the way for the readmission of divorced people still living in irregular relationships to the sacrament of the Eucharist. Müller vocally opposed the relaxation of the Catholic attitude towards people living in relationships outside of marriage, and as it had been adopted by Amoris Laetitia, the 2015 Vatican document on the family, that was instead strongly supported by the Pope. His criticism of the Pope is the reason Francis abruptly dismissed him in 2017, breaking the usual practice that the prefect is confirmed in his office until retirement and even beyond. The fact that he who used to be the second or third in rank after the Pope in the Vatican hierarchy is now an outspoken opponent of the Pope is a sign of the chaos that the Vatican is going through at the moment. Something unthinkable, even 5-10 years ago, is now happening. Over the last few years, Müller has become a reference point for those who are concerned with the direction that the Roman Catholic Church has taken under the leadership of Pope Francis. In the manifesto that he signed and drafted and signed, the German Cardinal talks of a, I quote, growing confusion about Catholic doctrine. Quote, today, many Christians are no longer even aware of the basic teachings of the faith. So there is a growing danger of missing the path to eternal life. His concern has to do with the undermining of Roman Catholic traditional tenets happening under Pope Francis. The Manifesto is a 4-page document posted in multiple languages that calls people from around the world to sign it as a way of affirming Catholic identity in this time of growing confusion. And the document has attracted thousands of signatures from around the world. The target is clearly Pope Francis and his apparent lack of theological reliability. Cardinal Müller wants to recover Roman Catholic doctrinal stability and breadth as it was envisaged in the Catechism of the Catholic Church, published in 1992, which was promulgated by Pope John Paul II and drafted under the leadership of the then Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger. While Francis is seen as causing confusion through his clumsy theology, John Paul II and Benedict XVI are seen as Roman bulwarks. The Catechism is, of course, the traditional explanation of the Catholic faith, beginning with the triune God, but basically centered on the sacramentality of the Church, which prolongs the ministry of Christ and therefore administers God's grace through the sacraments. Rather than the biblical gospel, in the Catechism, it is the sacramental life that shapes the Christian life according to the Cardinal. Rather than obedience to the biblical Jesus Christ, it is submission to the authority of the Roman Church that marks his proposal. Müller's antidote to Francis's downgrading is the retrieval of traditional Catholicism, not a recovery of the gospel, but the reaffirmation of Rome as the visible sign and instrument of salvation realized in the Catholic Church. You see, the point here is this: these critical internal voices who admit that the Church is going through a terrible time, their cure for healing the disease is to go back not to the gospel, the biblical gospel, but to go back to the recovery of traditional Catholicism. This is the way forward for them. They see Pope Francis undermining traditional Catholicism, and their way forward for them is to recover it. So it is not a better solution than what is happening. It is the attempt to go back to traditional Catholicism, marked and shaped by the sacramental system under the headship of the sacramental institutional Church. The solution proposed is not qualitatively different from the problem it wants to solve. On the other side of the Atlantic, in February, the tone against Francis has reached an unexpected peak. As I already mentioned, the article written by R.R. Reno on First Things begins in this shocking way, and I quote, and I urge you to listen to this quotation because it comes from a devout, conservative, traditionalist Catholic, but it appears as if it were written by a non-Catholic critic of the Church. Listen to what Reno wrote, I quote, "The current regime in Rome will damage the Catholic Church." He talks about a regime, not a government, not a form of leadership, a regime, a political tyranny. Again, I quote, "Pope Francis combines laxity and ruthlessness, a combination of laxity and ruthlessness. His style is casual and approachable. Church politics are cold and cunning. There are leading themes in this pontificate: mercy, peripheries, and so forth, but no theological framework. He is a verbal, semi-automatic weapon, squeezing off rounds of barbed remarks, spiritual aperçus, and earthly asides." I mean, these are devastating words for a Catholic to write against his Pope. Again, I quote from Rito, "This has created a confusing, even dysfunctional atmosphere that will become intolerable if it hasn't already." End of quote. And this is only the beginning. The article goes on to describe the situation of chaos that the Pope has brought to the Roman Church, adding more confusion to what was there before. What is happening in conservative Catholic circles? These are not words written by an outmoded fundamentalist spitting his emotional anti-Catholicism. First Things is an authoritative voice of conservative Catholicism and a strong advocate of the Roman Catholic worldview. In reading this trenchant critique, one cannot help but think, how can a Catholic author write this and still affirm Francis as Pope? How can a conservative Catholic read and written for decades that Roman Catholicism is unique and necessary because of the authoritative voice of the Pope, now criticize what the Pope is teaching and doing? You see what's happening? These circles are now becoming opponents of the office that they have defended for decades. Isn't there a contradiction? More fundamentally, are we sure is the main problem? Or is it not the monarchical, political, and self-proclaimed infallible papacy the issue at stake? Speaking. The problem in the relaxation of Catholic identity, that is, going back to traditional Catholicism, is not better than it. First Things sees the problem, that is, the confusion created by Pope Francis in his clumsy theology, but in no way wants to bring about a truly biblical reformation of the papacy. Seen from the outside, the battle between supporters and opposers of Pope Francis is of little significance if it does not lead to the recovery of the biblical gospel of salvation by faith alone and to a radical reorientation of the Roman Catholic Church. So, I have surveyed first the abuses that have been exposed to the public opinion and which have contributed significantly to the creation of this terrible year for the Catholic Church. Secondly, I have made reference to two critical voices coming from inside of the church and pointing to the crisis that the church is going through by pointing the finger to Pope Francis as the main responsible for this terrible year the Catholic Church is going through. But thirdly and lastly, I want now to bring your attention to a very recent, last week, short paper released by the Pope Emeritus, Joseph Ratzinger, who intervened in the present day discussion on the crisis the Catholic Church is going through. Joseph Ratzinger, Pope Benedict XVI, Pope Emeritus, has spoken, and his voice is noisy in the confusion that reigns in the Catholic Church. On the 11th of April, he released a 5,000-word text entitled "The Church and the Scandal of Sexual Abuse." That's the title of his text. And this text took by surprise Vatican officials who did not know about this initiative. And also it took by surprise the outside world. Although Benedict writes in his paper that he had informed Pope Francis and the Secretary of the Vatican State, the procedure chosen was totally unconventional, bypassing the institutional channels and distributing the text through a minor German magazine called Clericalism, and soon after bounced by websites which are often vocally critical of Pope Francis. You see, here's a former Pope, Pope Emeritus, who writes a paper and sends him out, not through the official channels of the Vatican, but through private channels and without the official channels even knowing what he was doing. This is totally unusual for a traditional, institutionalized body like the Catholic Church. Once Pope Francis was elected in office in March 2013, Benedict XVI, who had abruptly resigned from office, pledged to remain publicly silent for the rest of his life, dedicating his time to prayer and indicating the willingness not to interfere in the affairs of the Roman Church. But with this publication, with the publication of this long article, the silence is broken. The Pope Emeritus certainly continues to pray, but he also speaks out and does so loudly. The topic of his article is hot, very hot, in that it deals with the sexual abuses that are ruining the reputation of the Roman Catholic Church and which are spot on in its internal debates in this terrible year. Commenting on the text, the New York Times has labeled it a, I quote, post-retirement encyclical, a post-retirement encyclical, as if the Pope Emeritus had resumed his ordinary teaching in this turbulent time. Perhaps this is an overstatement. Content-wise, the article by Pope Emeritus is more of an historical, theological, and autobiographical reflection on the present-day crisis, written in the style of a personal testimony coming from a lifelong, prominent theologian, influential cardinal, and lately the retired pontiff of the Roman Church. Ratzinger traces the crisis that the Church is going through to the sexual revolution in the 60s, especially centered around the year of the 1968. And it traces it back to the collapse of Catholic doctrine and morality between the 60s and the 80s, the downfall of the distinction between good and evil and between truth and lies, not only in the secular culture, but also within Catholic theology and moral theology. The proliferation of tolerated, I quote, homosexual clubs, end of quote, in the Catholic seminaries. The fact that from the 60s onwards, Ratzinger says that homosexual clubs became to be tolerated in Catholic seminaries. And also, he traces it back to the imposition of the so-called due process that rendered untouchable those who justified these novelties, including pedophilia itself. In the final analysis, Ratzinger points out to the ultimate reason of the crisis in the departure from God in society as a whole and in the Church as well. So these are all the symptoms, but the root problem for Ratzinger is the departure from God in society and in the Church. He then calls his Church to recover the mystery of the presence of Christ in the Eucharist as the way to let God become central again. So he points out to the problem of God being displaced from the center, but his solution is to find or refine the centrality of God in the Church through the Eucharist, through the sacrament of the Eucharist. So not actually a biblical way of recovering the centrality of Christ. He doesn't talk about conversion, repentance, and placing the gospel at the center of life, but actually implementing the sacrament of the Eucharist as the principal way in which the centrality of God can regain center stage. In a sense, there is nothing new under the sun in what Benedict writes now. These broad historical and theological assessments have already been presented in his 1985 Ratzinger Report, a book interview on the state of the world and the Church, published when he was prefect of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. That was a book in 1985 where he actually argued in similar terms the problem of the modern world and by extension of the Church, the departure from God, as well as the same contents, the same arguments, the same evaluations can be found in the 2010 letter to the Catholics in Ireland, when Ratzinger was Pope, dealing with the abuses there in Ireland. Even in this letter, there are similar contents that we find in the new article released on April the 11th. This new article, in other words, breaks no new ground from the point of view of Ratzinger's views regarding the disastrous impact of the sexual revolution in the world and how it has impacted the Roman Church at all levels. What is significant in the article is the difference in analysis and tone from what the reigning Pope, Pope Francis, has been saying about the abuses. It is interesting to compare and contrast the analysis of Pope Francis on the present crisis and analysis of the Pope Emeritus on the same issue. And to see the differences not only in analysis, but also in the solutions which are proposed. Unlike Ratzinger, Francis has been quick to blame clericalism, as I already mentioned in the first part of my talk. That is the abuse of clerical power. According to Francis, this is the root of the scandals. But Francis never touched on the sexual relaxation of the Church's moral standards and the gradual acceptance of the presence of homosexuals amongst the clergy. For Francis, homosexuality seems to be a non-issue in the overall explanation of what has gone wrong. For him, homosexuality is a topic that cannot be dealt with publicly and honestly, unlike Ratzinger, who speaks about homosexual clubs becoming prominent in Catholic seminaries and hierarchy. So Francis is mute on the homosexuality issue, while Ratzinger is outspoken in denouncing it as one of the problems. The other main difference is that, unlike Ratzinger, who severely criticizes Western relativism both within and without the Church, both in its philosophical trajectory and moral results, Francis speaks more of the political allures of carrierism within the Church that has resulted in unscrupulous people making praise of vulnerable subjects. So whereas Ratzinger points to the fact that relativism has become prominent in society and in the Church, for Francis the main problem is political, not philosophical, theological, but political. It is the abuse of power, clericalism. That's the other main difference between Ratzinger and Francis. The first one being that Ratzinger is open about speaking of homosexuality or homosexuals as part of the problem, whereas Francis never speaks about homosexuality nor homosexuals. Secondly, Ratzinger speaks about relativism becoming part of how the Church thinks and operates, whereas Francis speaks about the abuse of power, speaks about a political problem, not a theological problem. But there is something deeper, though. The main thesis of the article is that the 60s were the decade of the sexual revolution and the Roman Church was devastated by it. So far, so good. But the 60s were also the decade of the Second Vatican Council, which took place between 1962 and 1965. The Second Vatican Council updated Rome's posture, gestures, and language, making it more friendly to the modern world. Indirectly, Ratzinger underlines the fact that in the 60s, Roman Catholic moral theology ceased to argue from the objective basis of natural law and began to play with the idea that morality was to be exclusively determined by the purposes of human action, making therefore all judgments relative. The Pope Emeritus denounces a, quote, new modern Catholicity that overturned the traditional moral fabric of Catholic theology and opened the door to the justification of homosexuality and other sexual promiscuities in seminaries and among the clergy. Without Ratzinger saying it explicitly, it was as if Vatican II lowered the bar and relaxed the standards of Roman Catholic theology and ethics to the point of eroding the moral consistency of the Church from within. While Francis often uses Vatican II to bang conservatives on their heads, Ratzinger's analysis of the effects of the Council is much more nuanced, if not critical. It is as if Francis stresses the genius of the Catholicity of Vatican, that is, its openness, renewal, inclusion, accommodation, whereas the old Ratzinger sees its problematic outcomes that have plagued the Church. Now, here's the final observation. Here we have a document coming from the Pope Emeritus, who vowed to remain silent for the rest of his life, and yet has become unconventionally outspoken about what has gone wrong in the Catholic Church, suggesting his own analysis and offering his own cure. And this is happening at the very top levels of the Catholic Church, indicating that what used to be a stable, top-down, disciplined institution is now a place where different voices, different readings of the situation, and different accounts of the problem can be heard, even to the point of attacking the Pope, attacking the hierarchy, and also pass very critical judgments on what the top leadership is doing in leading the Church. So what can we learn, or what can we suggest as evangelicals? We have to watch what is happening. We have to be aware of what is happening in the Catholic Church. And we have to realize that perhaps we are in the way in which the Catholic Church thinks of itself, no longer marked by stability, but more marked by fluidity, and also marked by the presence of critical voices from within. However, this is not to say that these critical to the need of a biblical reformation within the Church. They point to the recovery of a pre-Vatican II type of Catholicism, marked by the sacraments, the Catechism, the obedience to the Church, and so on and so forth. So we should not be trapped, in my view, in the idea that Catholic conservatives are better positioned with regard to the gospel. The gospel is still away from the progressives and the traditionalists. The current debate between progressives and conservatives not necessarily means that a recovery of the biblical gospel is in view. It's an internal dynamics happening within the Catholic Church itself, and we should be very interested in observing, listening carefully, evaluating what it is happening, and praying that the force, the strength, the power of the gospel will break the resistances, the stratified structures and ways of thought that have prevented so far the Catholic Church from being radically impacted by the gospel itself. So I think I have covered what I wanted to say as far as my presentation goes, and I'm open to read or listen to your comments and your questions and your contributions.
Leonardo, I'm from Australia. I'm from Melbourne, Australia. We met very, very briefly in the lift back in Poland. And George Pell has been very, very prominent. He's Cardinal Pell.
Yeah.
He's just been put into prison. And there's this enormous debate in our society about Roman Catholic abuses.
Yeah.
His cathedral is about 10 blocks from our church, and it's very hard to know what to say into this whole scenario. So there are good people who would think that he's not guilty, people who think that he is, and so the place is in turmoil in terms of this particular case. He's a Victorian person at Ballarat, and the Roman Catholic Church, all sorts of people don't know how to speak into that. So can you help me in terms of how to speak into this? He's going to be appealing. The case comes up for appeal, and so my question really is, I guess, how accurate is Joseph Ratzinger's analysis regarding these homosexual clubs in the various theological institutions? Because that really, people have sort of wondered about that as well.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you, Richard. I guess that as far as the first point of your question goes concerning Cardinal Pell, it is difficult. It is always difficult to make personal assessments of things that we don't know fully, or at least we know only through the media, through something that we can gather from the information available. And ultimately, it is difficult to make a case, a definitive case, out of a partial access to information. And certainly, Cardinal Pell's case is not isolated. There are many high-rank officials who are now under trial in France, in Chile, in Nicaragua, and other places, and these are bishops. There are also many priests. So it indicates the fact that Cardinal Pell is not an isolated case. It is actually, whether or not he's guilty, we don't have, you know, the evidence. We don't. At least I don't have the arguments.
Yeah.
Although I hear
Yeah.
different evidences from one voice or another, but it
Yeah.
indicates the fact that it is more the case of a system than the case of a person, and I think this should be our attitude, not to personalize or to make
Yeah.
it personal in order to fight against a person, individual, but actually trying to take advantage of asking questions on the reliability of the system, the reliability of the church as a whole, pointing to the need to go beyond a war in favor or against a person, but actually realizing that the church that claimed to be indefectible, claimed to be the societas perfecta, the perfect society, is instead in a terrible state, and for ages this terrible state is not dealt with properly. I think that would be my own approach, escaping the battle between those who are in favor or are opposed to the single individual, but trying to suggest the big picture, suggest the questions and analysis on the big picture. With regards to Ratzinger's paper, I think he speaks out of personal acquaintance and knowledge. He doesn't, and I think he's in the paper, he makes reference to even anecdotal evidence showing that in the 60s and 70s in Catholic seminaries in Germany, his books were considered as outmoded, and those who would have read his books, those students would be considered as belonging to a world that had already passed by. And so when he speaks about homosexual clubs, he seems to rely on personal experience and personal autobiographical memories or memoirs, and so people can have different ideas, but that's the way he does, and it doesn't give evidence, statistical evidence. It's not a sociological paper trying to present the evidence for this reality. It's a testimony, it's a personal testimony based on personal memories, and indicating the fact that these clubs were not occasional, but were very well rooted in not one single context only, but spread out across the educational system of the Catholic Church. And if you push that memoir further, those homosexual clubs perhaps have become circles outside of seminaries within the power structure of the Church. And this is actually something that also other voices are saying, that even in the Vatican, even in the various national Catholic churches, there are circles which are marked by the protection of homosexuals, or and therefore making it a mark of the church as a whole, and not just of the seminaries of the 70s. So it is very interesting to read this insider's testimony coming from someone who has been a highly respected professor, a highly respected cardinal, prefect of the Sacred Congregation of the Faith, and Pope. So he is actually saying something out of his personal biography, and what he says cannot be, easily disclaimed, because it doesn't come from me. If I would say this, that it would be easy to debunk this, but it comes from the highest voice next to the present reigning Pope.
Right. With a lot of people in our society in Melbourne here are saying, well, if they just allow these guys to get married, that would help. What do you say to that?
Sorry, can you repeat the question, please?
A lot of people are saying that if they did not have celibacy, that would help.
That would help. Yeah. That's an argument. Yeah. That's more of a consequentialist argument, or that's more of a moral argument. If you open up the door for marriage, then you probably have less cases of hidden sexual active practices. I think that this is an argument that has no counter-proof, in the sense that if it is based only on a consequentialist argument, there is no reference to the contrary. I think we have a better argument in having a biblical argument, allowing for servants of the church or in the church to have married lives and families. And there is a wisdom in that biblical teaching that goes beyond sociological probable explanations of something that we don't have the contrary evidence to be confronted with.
Thank you.
I will maybe add a question that I've received, and while the people are registering. It's from Drake. Can you compare the way that the Catholic Church is handling the problems with sexuality in relation to the Baptist Church?
If the question has to do with the Baptist churches of, say, the Southern Baptist Convention in the US, where there have been allegations of sexual abuses happening in that context, that's a very, very important question, and it is to be seen what the Southern Baptist Convention is going to do to deal with them. We have to bear in mind that large institutions often try to self-protect themselves and to hide their problems in order to save their face, so to speak, and to have a public good, or try to have a public good face. But when the evidence is there, when the evidence cannot no longer be hidden, then there is a responsibility for them to deal with them seriously and promptly. I am under the impression that only recently the Catholic Church has been really taking seriously what was happening inside of itself as far as the sexual abuse scandals. And I guess that even in large evangelical bodies are not exempted of this attitude of hiding problems, internal problems. I have hopes that the Southern Baptist Conventions, and not only in the US, but every evangelical church, every evangelical denomination, every evangelical circle, every evangelical association makes the most makes the effort to deal with the problem, if they have had a problem, in order to deal with it without any hesitation, and in order to implement ways of dealing with it that would prevent it from happening again. It is a test case for the credibility of Christian witness, the way in which we deal with the offenders, the victims, and the way in which we deal with preventing these scandals to happen. It is something that speaks about our seriousness. It speaks about the credibility of our faith, and it is an important test issue that I hope and pray that we will not miss, and therefore we will not dishonor the name of God and the good witness of the gospel.
I would ask one more question, if it is okay, Leonardo. There was a question: what are the changes in the Italians' attitudes towards Roman Catholicism and evangelical Protestantism?
Yeah, in Italy, there's been a traditional resistance of the media sector to expose the scandals within the Catholic Church. I mean, the system here has been very protective, and scandals have not been denounced with the same openness and clarity than elsewhere. The public opinion is therefore has been exposed to a lesser extent to what is happening in the church, and is learning from what is happening in Australia, in the US, in Germany, of the seriousness of the problem that the Catholic Church has. So it doesn't mean that in Italy the Catholic Church has behaved in a better way. It simply means that cases have been covered up and have been hidden more cleverly from being expected by the public opinion. The overall assessment and attitude of the public opinion with regards to the Catholic Church is becoming more critical, more cynical, more skeptical, because it has been eroding the moral credibility of the message and the institution of the Church. It remains to be seen whether or not the skepticism would result in an openness for the gospel, or will result in a more radical distancing from all religious discourse. This is something yet to be seen.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Okay, if you don't have any other questions, Richard?
Yes.
Okay.
Leonardo, I'm just wondering, are there any voices in the institution that are calling for people to come back to the gospel of Jesus Christ? Are there any voices at all coming back, calling us to come back, calling the church, the Roman Catholic institution, back to the gospel?
Yeah, I thank you, Richard. I would really love to hear those voices, but unfortunately, from what I read, what I observe, the only voices that I hear, like Pope Ratzinger, the recent document that he wrote, have to do with the calling to go back to traditional Catholicism and traditional accounts and patterns and forms and styles of the Catholic faith within the Catholic Church. Unfortunately, I don't hear voices really prophetic voices, so to speak, calling back the church to the roots of the gospel. And I think this is a missed opportunity if that doesn't happen. And we should pray that in this turmoil, in this chaos, in this terrible year, God will raise new Luthers, new Calvins, new Cranmers, because in many ways, I don't want to play with this idea very much, but in many ways, the moral corruption that the Catholic Church is facing now shows similarities with the situation at the beginning of the 16th century. Now, the problem then was not moral only. It was primarily a problem that had to do with the gospel and the biblical gospel. And so now the problem is not primarily moral, although it has a huge moral component. The problem has to do with the recovery of the biblical gospel. And so we should pray that voices will rise up in the Catholic Church and outside to ask and to call the people to rediscover something that has been lost or covered up across the centuries.
Thank you so much, Leonardo, for your talk again and for the discussion here.
Thank you.
We used almost all the 90 minutes for this webinar. So thank you so much for being with us for tonight, and thank you all for being here and having questions and discussing with us. Thank you, Leonardo.
Thank you very much.